Pelican Bay SHU. Inside California's most restrictive unit, PrisonDocumentary. For decades, a single prison wing in Northern California held men the world was not meant to see. No contact. No sunlight. No conversation. Just years of silence behind concrete walls. This was not a punishment for a new crime. It was a sentence of isolation handed out inside another sentence. The government called it security. Those who lived there called it slow disappearance. This is the story of Pelican Bay's security housing unit, the experiment that changed how America defines solitary confinement. If you're intrigued by the hidden world inside Pelican Bay, make sure to hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to follow this journey through the mental effects of solitary confinement prison in America. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes. Viewer discretion is advised. The creation of Pelican Bay. In 1989, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, opened Pelican Bay State Prison, near Crescent City on the rugged North Coast. It was built to isolate what officials described as the most dangerous prisoners in the system. The heart of the facility was the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, a separate complex of more than 1,000 windowless cells. According to CDCR's official overview, each cell measured roughly 8 by 10 feet, furnished only with a concrete bunk, a stainless steel toilet, and fluorescent light that never fully went dark. Prisoners assigned to the SHU were confined alone for 22 to 24 hours a day. Meals were passed through small metal slots. Exercise took place in a concrete yard barely larger than a garage. Visits occurred behind glass, and conversations with other inmates were rare or forbidden. CDCR officials argued that such strict control was necessary to prevent gang communication and protect staff safety. But from the beginning, outside observers questioned whether isolation on this scale could be justified. By the early 1990s, attorneys and journalists who gained limited access began to describe the unit as a prison within a prison. Letters from inmates painted a different picture than the official reports, one of monotony, anxiety, and growing psychological distress. In 2012, the Center for Constitutional Rights published Torture in Pelican Bay: Voices from Solitary Confinement. That report compiled direct accounts from men who had lived inside the SHU for 10, 15, or even 20 years. They spoke about losing their sense of time, talking to themselves to stay sane, and feeling detached from reality. The report concluded that the conditions met international standards for psychological torture. Around the same period, Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist from the University of California, Santa Cruz, studied Pelican Bay inmates for his 2003 article, Mental Health Issues in Long-Term Solitary and Supermax Confinement. He documented consistent symptoms: panic, memory loss, hypersensitivity to noise, and deep depression, linking them to prolonged isolation. Haney's research warned that the SHU was creating lasting mental health harm that ordinary prison systems were unequipped to treat. By the late 2000s, these findings began to shape public opinion. What was originally presented as a necessary tool for safety had become one of the most contested practices in modern corrections. A group of Pelican Bay prisoners would soon take their protest beyond the walls, into federal court, forcing the state to answer a simple but historic question. Can a society built on justice keep a person in isolation forever? The legal challenge, Ashker v. Brown. By 2009, the debate over Pelican Bay's security housing unit had reached a breaking point. Inside the prison, men who had lived in solitary confinement for decades began organizing through letters, legal correspondence, and advocacy networks outside the walls. At the center of this effort was Todd Ashker, a long-term SHU inmate who had spent more than 20 years in isolation. Together with other prisoners, Ashker filed a federal class action lawsuit against the state of California, Ashker v. Brown, Case No. C09-05796CW, arguing that indefinite solitary confinement violated the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Their claim was simple but historic. Prisoners were being kept in solitary confinement not because of violent acts, but because they were accused of having gang ties, often based on confidential notes, tattoos, or artwork interpreted by prison investigators. Legal filings revealed that hundreds of inmates had remained in the SHU for 10 years or longer, and some had spent over 2 decades without physical contact with another human being. Attorneys representing the prisoners, along with the Center for Constitutional Rights, argued that this system amounted to psychological harm and punishment without due process. The CCR's documentation included testimonies describing sleep deprivation, disorientation, and declining mental health. Independent experts, including Dr. Craig Haney, provided research showing that extended isolation caused measurable cognitive and emotional damage. While the lawsuit progressed, pressure was building both inside and outside the prison walls. In 2011, Pelican Bay inmates launched what became one of the largest prison hunger strikes in California history. Over 6,000 prisoners statewide joined in solidarity, refusing meals to protest indefinite confinement and demand reforms. A second hunger strike in 2013 saw participation grow to nearly 30,000 inmates, attracting national attention and prompting an investigation by major news outlets, including the Los Angeles Times. The LA Times published a detailed investigation titled Pelican Bay Prison, a long-term solitary confinement experiment, 2013, documenting the physical and psychological toll on those living inside the SHU. The article highlighted accounts of men who had not seen the horizon for decades, describing isolation as a slow erosion of the human mind. Public pressure intensified. Civil rights organizations, mental health experts, and former prison officials began to question whether the SHU model was compatible with constitutional and ethical standards. In 2015, after years of litigation and negotiation, the parties reached a landmark settlement. The state of California agreed to end the practice of indefinite solitary confinement and to significantly reduce the number of inmates held in isolation. Under the settlement, the CDCR committed to transferring hundreds of prisoners out of the SHU and to creating new, behavior-based housing programs that offered pathways back to general population units. The outcome of Ashker versus Brown became one of the most significant prison reform victories in modern U.S. history. For the first time, a federal court formally recognized that decades-long isolation, imposed without clear behavioral justification, violated fundamental standards of humane treatment. Yet, for many men who had lived in Pelican Bay's SHU for years, freedom from the cell did not mean freedom from its effects. Their release into open yards or lower security prisons revealed a deeper struggle, one that no court ruling could immediately undo. The aftermath of isolation. The 2015 settlement in Ashker versus Brown marked a historic turning point for California's prison system. After decades of debate, the era of indefinite solitary confinement at Pelican Bay was officially over. But for those who had lived inside the security housing unit, some for 10, 20, even 30 years, the damage was already done. According to post-settlement data from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, more than 1,500 prisoners were transferred out of the SHU within the first year. Many of them were returned to general population units for the first time in decades. The change was a victory for human rights advocates, but it also exposed the long-term psychological and social effects of extreme isolation. Former SHU inmates interviewed by journalists and researchers described the world outside as disorienting. After years in silence, normal prison environments, full of noise, movement, and human contact, felt overwhelming. Simple tasks such as walking in a crowd, holding eye contact, or engaging in conversation triggered anxiety. Some said they experienced confusion in open spaces. Others struggled to sleep without the familiar hum of their cell's ventilation system. Psychologist Dr. Craig Haney, who had warned of these effects in his earlier research, later described this adjustment process as evidence of social atrophy. In his analysis, long-term isolation dulls the skills needed for basic social interaction, empathy, trust, and emotional regulation. He compared it to learning to live in society all over again. Meanwhile, oversight groups continued to monitor Pelican Bay and other high-security facilities. A 2018 review by correctional reform advocates found that although the number of inmates in solitary had dropped dramatically, restricted housing units still existed under new names such as administrative segregation or short-term isolation. These newer units were designed to limit, but not eliminate, the use of solitary confinement. The Center for Constitutional Rights cautioned that while the Ashker settlement brought meaningful change, the fight against isolation in all its forms must continue. Their reports emphasized that reforms were only effective if prison officials resisted returning to old patterns under new labels. At Pelican Bay itself, the SHU still stood, a concrete reminder of an era when silence and isolation defined punishment. Many cells were repurposed for short-term segregation or other administrative uses, but the physical design remained largely unchanged: narrow corridors, sealed doors, and fluorescent lights that blurred the passage of time. Former staff members interviewed by the Los Angeles Times reflected on those years with mixed feelings. Some defended the SHU as a necessary response to the gang violence of the 1980s and 1990s. Others admitted that the system had gone too far, isolating individuals for so long that it stripped them of any chance at rehabilitation. The Ashker case had shown that reform could emerge even from within the most rigid systems. But it also revealed a deeper truth: that the effects of solitary confinement are not easily undone by policy changes or legal rulings. They remain in the memories, habits, and mental health of the people who lived through it. By the end of the decade, Pelican Bay had become both a symbol and a warning. A symbol of control in a system built on discipline, and a warning of how easily security can cross into psychological harm when oversight fades. The story of the SHU forced California, and the nation, to confront a fundamental question: how far can a society go to maintain order before it begins to lose its humanity? The ripple effect: reform across the nation. The transformation of Pelican Bay's security housing unit did not stop at California's borders. The Ashker versus Brown settlement in 2015 sent a message that echoed across the American correctional system. A message that questioned whether long-term solitary confinement could exist in a nation that values constitutional rights and human dignity. After the settlement, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, implemented a new policy known as the Step-Down Program. Instead of assigning prisoners to indefinite isolation based on gang affiliation, the program introduced a behavior-based system that allowed inmates to earn their way back to general population units through participation and compliance. This approach aimed to reduce violence while addressing mental health concerns raised by years of academic and legal criticism. Reports from the Center for Constitutional Rights and independent prison monitors confirmed a significant drop in the number of individuals held in extreme isolation. According to follow-up data cited by CCR, the number of prisoners in long-term solitary confinement in California decreased by more than 80% within a few years. This dramatic reduction was viewed nationally as one of the most successful examples of prison reform through litigation and negotiation. Other states began to take notice. Following California's reforms, states such as Colorado, New York, and New Jersey introduced new restrictions on the use of solitary confinement, citing similar legal and psychological concerns. In Colorado, for example, prison administrators moved to limit solitary confinement to a maximum of 15 consecutive days, aligning with international human rights standards set by the United Nations Mandela Rules. Public discussion around mental health in prisons grew stronger, supported by decades of research like that of Dr. Craig Haney, whose work at Pelican Bay continued to inform national correctional policy. The Los Angeles Times, reflecting on the aftermath of the Pelican Bay case, described the shift as a quiet revolution in corrections. What began as a legal battle by a handful of inmates in isolation had forced a system-wide reckoning about the purpose of punishment and the boundaries of humane treatment. Still, reform did not erase controversy. Critics pointed out that while official solitary confinement numbers declined, new forms of restrictive housing had emerged under different names: administrative segregation, disciplinary detention, or protective custody, sometimes reproducing similar conditions in practice. Advocates, including the Center for Constitutional Rights, warned that without transparency and consistent oversight, states could return to old patterns under new policies. In California, watchdog groups continued to report progress but emphasized that monitoring and mental health support remained essential. The CDCR increased access to psychological services, expanded group therapy programs, and introduced new criteria for housing assignments based on behavior rather than suspicion alone. These changes reflected lessons learned from the Pelican Bay experience, that security measures must always be balanced with accountability and human welfare. By the early 2020s, Pelican Bay's SHU stood as both a historical symbol and an ongoing reminder. It represented a time when the line between discipline and deprivation blurred beyond recognition, and a moment when those once hidden behind concrete walls reshaped the very laws that confined them. Today, conversations about solitary confinement continue in legislatures, courts, and advocacy circles across the country. The reforms inspired by Pelican Bay have not solved every issue, but they have changed the way America talks about punishment, rehabilitation, and human rights behind bars. The story of Pelican Bay's SHU remains a defining chapter in that conversation, a testament to how endurance, research, and law can expose the unseen and force even the most rigid systems to evolve. Life after the SHU, facing the world again. For the men who lived for decades inside the security housing unit at Pelican Bay, release from solitary confinement did not mean freedom from its effects. When the Ashker versus Brown settlement took effect in 2015, hundreds of prisoners were moved from isolation cells into general population units or other facilities. But many soon discovered that returning to a world filled with sound, light, and human contact was one of the hardest transitions of their lives. Researchers who followed the post-settlement period, including Dr. Craig Haney, described what they saw as a form of institutional trauma. After years of confinement in small, silent spaces, the human nervous system adapts to stillness and control. Sudden exposure to open areas, group movement, and constant noise can cause anxiety, confusion, and emotional withdrawal. Simple experiences, a handshake, a shared meal, a crowded yard, could feel overwhelming. Former SHU inmates who spoke to journalists and advocacy groups echoed these findings. Some said they found it difficult to trust others or to communicate after decades of isolation. Others described trouble sleeping or maintaining concentration, symptoms consistent with long-term sensory deprivation. The Center for Constitutional Rights noted that this adjustment process underscored why solitary confinement is considered by mental health professionals to have lasting psychological consequences. For many of these men, reintegration meant not only learning to interact again but also proving that they could function safely within the larger prison system. Under the step-down program introduced by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, prisoners transferred from the SHU were given access to group activities, education, and gradual exposure to social environments. Reports from correctional officials indicated that, contrary to early fears, the majority of these former SHU inmates did not return to violence. This outcome challenged the long-standing assumption that isolation was the only effective way to manage high-risk prisoners. In interviews published by the Los Angeles Times and other outlets, some correctional officers acknowledged that they, too, had witnessed the psychological toll of the SHU. Several described seeing men change over time, becoming quieter, less responsive, or deeply withdrawn. One officer was quoted saying that the experience had made everyone inside those walls different, inmates and staff alike. Academic studies have continued to build on the foundation laid by Haney's early research, expanding the understanding of how isolation affects the brain. Findings published in criminology and psychology journals show that long-term solitary confinement can impair memory, emotional control, and decision-making. Experts now recommend that any form of isolation be strictly time-limited and paired with regular mental health assessments. Today, Pelican Bay's SHU is no longer the massive isolation facility it once was. The structure still stands, its concrete corridors largely unchanged, but its role in the state's correctional system has shifted. Some of its cells are used for short-term administrative housing, while others remain empty, serving as a physical reminder of a policy that defined an era. For the men who lived there, the memory of that silence remains permanent. Many describe it not simply as a place but as a state of mind that they carry long after leaving its walls. Their stories continue to inform legal arguments, academic studies, and public debates about humane treatment in prisons. In the years since the settlement, the influence of the Pelican Bay case has spread beyond California. National discussions about criminal justice reform now include mental health as a core concern, and many states have adopted limits on solitary confinement for juveniles, individuals with mental illness, and long-term prisoners. What began with letters smuggled out of a remote facility has evolved into a broader movement for transparency and accountability in U.S. corrections. The legacy of Pelican Bay's SHU is therefore twofold. It exposed the deep psychological costs of isolation and showed that even the most entrenched systems can change when truth and evidence are brought to light. Its story remains one of endurance, a reminder of how human resilience and advocacy can redefine what justice looks like inside the walls of a prison. The legacy of Pelican Bay. More than 3 decades after it opened, Pelican Bay State Prison has become one of the most studied and debated correctional institutions in American history. What began as an ambitious project to contain violence through isolation evolved into a nationwide discussion about the limits of punishment and the definition of human rights inside prison walls. The 2015 Ashker v. Brown settlement marked not only a victory for those directly affected but also a turning point in correctional philosophy. Before the lawsuit, California held thousands of prisoners in solitary confinement, many for indefinite periods. Within just a few years after the settlement, that number fell sharply, a change recognized by national reform groups and international observers as one of the largest reductions of solitary confinement in modern history. Reports from the Center for Constitutional Rights, CCR, and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, confirmed that the reforms at Pelican Bay became a model for other states. The Step Down Program, a process built on behavior-based reviews rather than indefinite classification, demonstrated that stability and safety could be maintained without relying on permanent isolation. Academic and policy circles took notice. Psychologists, legal scholars, and human rights organizations began citing Pelican Bay as a key example in studies about incarceration and mental health. Research like Dr. Craig Haney's earlier work helped lay the scientific foundation for understanding how solitary confinement changes brain function and behavior. His findings were later referenced in state legislative hearings and correctional reform proposals across the country. The Los Angeles Times, reflecting on the case years later, described it as the moment America looked inside its prisons and saw what it had ignored for too long. That visibility, once impossible because of the isolation itself, became the very tool that forced reform. By the early 2020s, the effects of Pelican Bay's transformation could be seen across the United States. In Colorado, New York, and New Jersey, lawmakers passed legislation limiting or banning long-term solitary confinement, citing both human rights concerns and evidence from California's experience. International observers, including members of the United Nations Human Rights Council, pointed to Pelican Bay as an example of how sustained legal pressure and credible research could change an entire state's correctional policy. Still, advocates remain cautious. Organizations such as the CCR and the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, continue to monitor how states interpret restricted housing and administrative segregation. They warn that reforms must be ongoing, not symbolic, that changing terminology without changing practice only hides the same reality under new names. Pelican Bay's legacy, therefore, is more than a case study in law or psychology. It represents a national reckoning with a question that transcends prison walls. How should a society measure justice? By control, or by the capacity to restore what isolation takes away? The story of Pelican Bay's SHU stands as proof that the answers to such questions are not found in silence but in transparency, accountability, and humanity. A lesson written in concrete and silence. From 1989 to today, Pelican Bay's security housing unit has stood at the edge of America, a fortress built on the belief that isolation could bring control. For years it did. But it also revealed something far deeper about the human condition. Solitary confinement did not erase violence, it exposed the cost of forgetting compassion. The men who lived through it became living evidence of what happens when punishment exceeds purpose. Their voices, once sealed behind steel doors, reshaped laws, challenged institutions, and forced a nation to look inward. The story of Pelican Bay is not just about a prison. It is about the power of truth to pierce silence, the resilience of those who refuse to be forgotten, and the ongoing fight to ensure that no one disappears behind walls in the name of security. Real justice is not measured by how long a person can be locked away, but by whether a society can learn, reform, and remember.